Welcome to the Healthy Gut Podcast with Rebecca Coombs, the place where you can learn how to achieve a happy, healthy gut. Here's what's coming up on today's show. Hi guys, welcome to today's episode of the Healthy Gut Podcast. Before we kick off, I just wanted to give you another update about the events that I have happening in the US while I'm there on my tour. So I've got events coming to you in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, and hopefully Boston and New York. And I'll also be heading to Phoenix for almost an entire week for the AANP conference. If you're going to be there, I would definitely love to see you. Make sure you come say hi. If you'd like to hear more about the events, head to thehealthygut.co/events. That's the place where I am updating the event information every single day as tickets become available. And you can also put your name and email address down to subscribe to hear the moment a new event launches in your city. So I do hope you'll pop your details down because I would love to see you in person. So without further ado, let's get into today's show. On today's show, we're joined by Heather Jacobsen, who is an author, researcher, and founder of the online magazine stuffedpeppercom. She has an MSc in ethnobotany and worked at Fairchild Tropical Botanic Garden and the National Academy of Sciences. In dealing with health issues that no conventional doctor seemed to be able to solve, she has unravelled the true science behind gluten, grains, and chronic disease. Her latest project involves researching and writing about the effects of stress on the body and practical steps one can take in alleviating chronic stress. I hope you enjoy today's episode with Heather Jacobsen. Heather Jacobsen, welcome to the Healthy Gut Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. And we actually got connected by the lovely Dr. Norm Robillard, who has been on the Healthy Gut Podcast talking all about the fast track diet. And I'm really interested in your story. You chronicle your own personal journey from going from chronic illness and now to a gluten-free life. So I'd love for you to share with my listeners your own experience with starting to reclaim your health.
Yeah, sure. I'll do the best I can not to talk too much because it is actually a long story. It's actually a lifelong story, but I'll give you the highlights. Basically, I had tummy problems probably for as long as I can remember, and I was always sick in general as a child, which of course now we know that a healthy gut equals a healthy immune system, so I probably didn't have too healthy of a gut back then. I had my tonsils taken out. I had all kinds of like mononucleosis, all kinds of stuff. I was always sick with something. And in high school, I remember being bloated a lot. And, we're very, we're in high school, teenagers are very concerned about how we look, our appearance. And I remember always feeling, that my tummy was really fat. It wasn't really fat though. It was bloated all the time. And I was uncomfortable. And then in college, I actually had abdominal pain so badly one night I couldn't finish studying for an exam that I had the next day. And I was generally a very good student, so I felt really guilty about this, but it was just such excruciating pain that I couldn't do the exam. So, I told my father, and then he sent me to a doctor, and the doctor had me do a colonoscopy. And unfortunately, I guess, the doctor didn't find anything. So, he communicated that back to my father. My father, interpreted that as that it was all in my head. It was just too much stress from exams. But I knew it had to be more than just that. It wasn't just the exams. But nothing was ever found. And I wouldn't eat on campus anymore because whenever I was on campus, I would feel really sick with any of the foods at the mess hall. So I usually just ate salads, and I even brought my own salad dressing in my purse to the mess hall, because it was just, I just felt there was something somewhere that I was eating that was causing me sickness, but I could never figure out what it was. And then in 1998, I had an emergency appendectomy. And then just 6 weeks after that, miraculous timing. It was too coincidental, I thought, for it to be coincidence, really. The timing was just too close. I started developing really strange symptoms that doctors, one after the other, couldn't figure out what it was. I think I got diagnosed with fibromyalgia at one point, and some people, they were just clueless. They had no idea. But basically, I couldn't sleep at night. I felt always very tense. I was losing a lot of weight. And it turns out that I had Graves' disease, which is an autoimmune thyroid disorder in which the thyroid goes hyperactive. And now most people probably have heard of Hashimoto's and the hypoactive thyroid, but this is the opposite. And it can be really dangerous if it goes unchecked. Unfortunately, the doctor's advice then was the only option was to ablate the thyroid, to give me radioactive iodine. And it was like, I think one of the worst decisions that I made was to trust this doctor. But I tried to do a little research, but this was back in 1998. We didn't have the internet that had, tons of research out there and tons of information. Sometimes you have to filter through it, but it was really not easy for me to figure out if there were any other options than what this doctor told me. So that's what I did. We took the radioactive iodine, and it ablated my thyroid. And to this day now, I have to take hormone replacement, thyroid replacement. Even no matter how well I eat, and whatever, I'm still going to always have to deal with that. That was 98. And then in 2001, I was on a work abroad program. I had left my boyfriend back in Washington, D.C. and went on a work abroad program. And I landed in London on September 11th. We were staying at a fellow student's house. We turned on the TV, and there I saw the Twin Towers, and people jumping out of the buildings, and I was just in awe. And they just kept playing this loop over and over again. I tried to figure out where my husband was, because I should say my boyfriend. He's not my husband, but he was in Washington, D.C., and of course, the Pentagon also was targeted. And I kept trying to reach him, and I couldn't reach him. And then I was with these students that were not American, and one of them was saying that we deserved it, So it was a really horrible feeling for me, as well as many other people, of course, obviously in the U.S. So it's kind of funny timing, because also during that week, there was another student that was in charge of our food budget, and he decided to go. This is what he bought for the week. I ended up eating a diet that was really, foreign to my system. So basically for breakfast, we had like Wonder White bread toast. And then for lunch, we had bologna sandwiches on white bread. And for dinner, we had pasta. And then I probably had a beer or two within all that. And that was 3 or 4 days in a row that I ate like that. And then my body just couldn't take it anymore. And all of a sudden, I started losing hair in clumps. I had like big whitehead acne on my face, which was normally I had pretty clear skin. So that was a telltale sign that something wasn't right. And then my whole like digestive system just shut down. Like nothing was moving. It was just sitting there for days. And it's just interesting timing, because, well, first, let me say that I didn't know exactly right away what was going on, but I didn't feel like eating for days and even weeks afterwards. But when I did start eating, whenever I ate bread, I started to feel the same feeling, and I eventually put 2 and 2 together that bread was making me sick. And the interesting thing is the timing of it all. They say that a lot of times there's a stressful event that triggers an autoimmune disorder, and celiac disease is an autoimmune disorder. Graves' disease is an autoimmune disorder. So it's just hard. I don't know if the 9/11 attacks and me being separated from my boyfriend and feeling all alone, if that triggered the gluten intolerance, or if I was just susceptible to it, from an early age. But the timing is kind of interesting.
It is. And I listened to your story, and we've got such a similar story. I was also over in the UK for 9/11, and I had just turned up into London. It was the beginning of my life, which became 7 years of life over there. And I also remember switching on the television that morning. I was looking for work. I'd just arrived, literally 2 or 3 days prior, and seeing that just horrific footage being shown on a loop on the television. And it was awful and so stressful. And I had been traveling around Europe with a girlfriend, and she was flying back to Australia that night to move back to Australia. And we had to go out to Heathrow Airport, and it was just so stressful because we didn't know what was going to happen. And police over there don't generally carry guns. So to see a policeman with a gun or a policewoman is a pretty full-on experience in the UK because they don't normally walk around with them. In Australia and the US, it's very different. They carry guns on them, but it was quite intense. And I also was laughing at you talking about the food you ate, because I went into what's called dossing, where you sleep on people's couches in the UK, and you pay a nominal amount of money per night to sleep on a couch. It's not very comfortable. And you're broke, you're a backpacker, so you're eating white or beige food. And I also remember doing exactly the same thing, where as the flat, we would all chip in for our weekly food. And there's a supermarket over in the UK, which I don't know if you remember, called Iceland, when everything's frozen. And so you can get these big slabs of lasagna and frozen pasta and all sorts of white, beige frozen food, which our flat would live off. And I was the same. I would just feel miserable but not necessarily put two and two together. And then I was drinking beer because I'd never drunk pints of beer before. So you and I are so similar.
Oh my gosh, that's crazy. We probably might have even passed each other on the street there somewhere. Oh my gosh. And I also remember Yeah, and I also remember thinking, because riding the tube a lot, and thinking, well, if they did that, in New York City, they could also attack the tube, and being kind of like paranoid about riding the tube at that time was a little scary. But so
it was.
So to continue, like I said, I tried not to talk too much, but to continue the story, my then boyfriend then came to Denmark, which is where my study abroad program was actually out of Denmark, even though we were in London at that time. He came to Denmark and proposed to me just a little bit after that. So I left the school and went back to the US to be with him. And I went to some doctors, and I told them, look, I think that bread is causing me problems, and like I said, this was now 2001, so the internet was a little bit more helpful then. And I think I might have found the PubMed website or something, but I had learned about celiac disease. And so I was pretty sure that bread and gluten, were my issues. And so I went to a couple of doctors, and one of them laughed at me. It was like, oh no, you don't have celiac disease. And another one tried to give me an antibiotic, like that's going to help anything. But basically no one believed me, and they didn't want to test me. So to this day, I don't know if I ever had celiac disease or if I simply had gluten sensitivity. I mean, either way, it doesn't really matter, because when I eat gluten, I get very, very sick, and that's all that really matters.
It's so interesting hearing your experience, because it's not dissimilar to so many of my listeners and my own, whereby we know something is wrong and we go out seeking help, support and advice from medical practitioners. And unfortunately is what is so often the case still to this day, through their own lack of knowledge and awareness of conditions. Although I do think that gluten sensitivity is a lot more known about these days. Having a practitioner laugh at you is so demoralizing. How did you find the strength to go from doctors, really not being a support for you, to taking control and doing something about it?
Well, I mean, luckily, so when one of the doctors, like you say, it was really demoralizing. And when one of them laughed at me and said, "You don't have a problem with gluten," I went to my boyfriend. I was like, "Well, I guess I don't have a problem with gluten. So, let's go out and celebrate." And so we had pizza and beer. And guess what? I got sick. And it was clear as day that gluten was causing me a problem. So I just stopped eating it. And luckily, I did have my boyfriend that understood and saw everything that was going on, and he knew that this was an issue. So at least he supported me. But I did kind of like hide, in the corner of the office, in the office party when people were having, some celebration, and all there was bagels or cake, and I knew I couldn't eat it. It was something that I, kind of kept to myself for a long time because nobody really understood it. I tried to explain, when I eat bread, I get sick, but nobody understood it. And my own father, continue even to this day, kind of rolls his eyes at me and doesn't believe it. But I knew that it was making me sick, and that was enough. I mean, I felt so bad from it. It didn't make any sense for me to try and eat it, So, and I guess the good thing is that I had learned to cook from a young age. So obviously I had to do a lot of my own cooking. And so eating out for the longest time was really difficult, starting back in 2001. Now, obviously, it's a lot easier. And so it was probably about, 10 years later that gluten-free became a buzzword, and I started seeing bakeries pop up here and there, and other bloggers doing it. And then it was like, oh, okay, I'm not the only one. But it was for a while, difficult. And so I guess that's why I started the Stuffed Pepper website, was just to kind of be a resource for other people that are newly diagnosed with celiac disease or gluten sensitivity. The idea was, just to be sort of a hub of information and a recipe sharing site. And, I had sort of a simple idea of what it would be. But it turns out that as I owned a website, I started to become more of an authority on what it means to go gluten-free. And I thought it was pretty straightforward. You just don't eat wheat. But it turns out it's actually not straightforward at all. And that most people actually aren't healing on the gluten-free diet. And that was an eye-opening, medical paper that I came across, that, wait a minute, we're all kind of doing this gluten-free diet wrong.
It is really interesting, and something that you've mentioned, and I'll just sort of take a step back before we move forward in terms of what
Sure.
you do today, is around the testing piece. And I wonder whether, I'm the same as you. I've never been tested for celiac disease because I never wanted to do the 3 months of gluten consumption every day to be able to get a more positive test. Do you feel that would you like to know if you have celiac disease, or do you feel that you're able to manage just fine without that actual diagnosis?
Yeah, for a long time, I did want to have a diagnosis, and there were for two reasons. One, so that my dad and some of my friends that didn't believe me, would finally believe me. Look, here it says right on this piece of paper, I can't eat gluten. That would have been a nice confirmation, even though really in the end, I knew I couldn't anyway. The other reason would have been like, yeah, if I can say for certain that I have an issue with gluten, then I also can be careful about, keeping an eye out for my kids and any reactions that they have to gluten, because obviously celiac disease runs in the family. But I never did get the diagnosis, but I did see my daughter react to gluten. First to oats actually was the first thing that she reacted to, and it was a skin reaction when she was about 3. And then she started to react to peanuts, not like in an anaphylactic way, but just would get a rash. And then by then I was like, ooh, and then I think it was gluten. So we took gluten out of her diet too, and she's fine. And every once in a while we test her on it because, it's hard. She's almost 8. And when she goes to a birthday party, she's the only one with the gluten-free cupcake, and, she misses out sometimes on things. And so every once in a while I'll let her test it, but it still comes back that, she gets a rash when she's exposed to it. So my thinking is that, and also through some of the research that I've seen, that a lot of times gluten sensitivity, if you don't have full-blown celiac disease, you could have gluten sensitivity, and that even gluten sensitivity can be a precursor to celiac disease if it goes unchecked. So if you have gluten sensitivity, if you're somebody that reacts to gluten and you continue to eat gluten, you may actually you may actually develop celiac disease. So, I mean, at this point, having, been without gluten since 2001, having written a book on it and have a website on it, I don't need that piece of paper, that says that I have celiac disease or not. I know that gluten makes me sick, and that's all that matters. And the other thing is that now the wheat that we eat today is actually much, much different than it was 50 years ago. And some people are calling it, like the super glutens, because the gluten in the wheat today is more inflammatory than it ever has been. And some experts in celiac disease have shown that the wheat of today is actually causes an inflammatory reaction in pretty much everybody. It's just that some of us are more susceptible to it. So the wheat of today is actually not good for anybody for the most part.
It's really interesting that you talk about the wheat of today. And I know that in Australia and the US particularly, our crops are just so modified from what they used to be. They're sprayed heavily with pesticides and herbicides and toxins, and our breads are filled with preservatives and other agents to keep them on the shelf for longer. What I have found very interesting is that when I travel to Europe, particularly when I've been in France, where they have a very different method of producing food to us in the States and Australia, their bread is only designed to be consumed on the day it's made. And they have bakers working throughout the day. So you have your morning bread, you have your lunchtime bread, and you have your dinner bread, and it's baked for that purpose. And their crops aren't nearly as modified as what we have. And I actually can tolerate their gluten products so much better than I can any bread that I could eat in Australia. And particularly bread in the US is just like a little bomb for my digestive system.
Yeah.
And I found that really interesting. I was over in France about a year and a little bit ago, and I was studying French over there, and I was talking to my teacher, and I said, it's very interesting. I can eat so much more broadly here than I can back home. And she was saying to me, we are only just starting to see food intolerances arise in France. It's brand new for us, whereas you guys have had it for many decades. And it's so interesting just how much of an impact the way we treat our crops has on our digestive systems. And I've got some really interesting episodes for people that if they haven't gone and listened to them. Episode 30, I've interviewed Dr. Lisa Shaver all about celiac disease, and she talks about the importance these days of getting tested to know whether you do have celiac disease. I think it's difficult for those of us like you and I, Heather, who have been gluten-free for many, many years. And when we were first exploring it, it was just, we just didn't have the support from doctors, and we don't want to go back to eating that much gluten to get tested. But I think for anyone listening now who might suspect they might have an issue, I know Dr. Lisa Shaver talks a lot about the importance of getting tested. And I also have a great episode with Erica Jacobsen, who's a dietitian and nutritionist, on episode 29, talking about the differences of food sensitivities, intolerances, and allergies. And for anyone listening to us today who's thinking, what is the difference between a gluten sensitivity and a gluten allergy? That is a really great episode to go back and listen to. Let's talk about your website and your book, and really why you've set them up and how they're helping people today.
Sure. So, like I said, I created Stuffed Pepper when I started seeing more and more people going gluten-free, and that people were actually, aware of what the term was. So I had the idea back in 2001, and I thought it could be a good place to exchange recipes and that sort of thing. And I also had in mind that there would be some medical experts on celiac disease and gluten sensitivity that could weigh in from time to time, or put in some of their own blog posts to help people, with medical advice and nutrition tips and et cetera. But it turns out that, everybody started to get busy on their own. And so I had to start doing some of my own research. My idea was just to kind of host the site and be an editor basically of this magazine, this online magazine. But I had my own questions that I wanted answered, and I started doing more research, and it turns out that the way we're doing the gluten-free diet is really not helping anybody. The gluten-free diet, as we know, it has a very poor track record in healing people's guts. And there was one article, one paper that was written in, 2009, I think, that says that something like only 8% of people on the gluten-free diet healed their gut. 8%. Which is like really small. Now there's other studies out there that were a little bit better, but at best I saw like the best case scenario is that 1/3 of people on the gluten-free diet are healing their guts. That's not good. And that's why we have so many comorbidities in celiac disease and gluten sensitivity, because the gut has become compromised and it hasn't been fixed. And, I have on my website something like 200 disorders and diseases that are associated with celiac disease and gluten sensitivity. And so I wanted to find out, first of all, this is really depressing news. So the gluten-free diet isn't helping us. How are we going to get better? But, and I also thought it was surprising that not enough people are talking about this in the gluten-free community. Everybody's sharing recipes and sharing health advice, but nobody's talking about how our gluten-free diet is actually not helping us. So, first, after I got through the initial depression of this news, I figured, well, there's got to be some solutions. And so that's what I started looking at. And so a series of blog posts on my website was first what started this discussion and this research and this delving into, the true science behind the gluten-free diet. And then I turned those blog posts into a book. Which is, highly referenced in the medical literature, but I tried to make it as, digestible as possible to the layman as to just exactly why the gluten-free diet isn't working and what we can do about it.
And why is that? Why is it not working? And it's so interesting that there's that research, because I know that myself, when I went gluten-free, I had several months of reprieve, but then I started to feel quite ordinary again. And I started to feel quite sick on those gluten-free alternatives, the gluten-free breads, the gluten-free pastas, I'd go crazy on. I'd be like, oh, it's gluten-free. I can eat as much as I want.
Right. Well,
so why is it not working for us?
Right. So, it's interesting that you went gluten-free about the same time that I did. And so for a long time back then, there was no point in eating gluten-free breads because they were, like cardboard. I mean, there was no fun in it at all. So probably you, like me, ate sort of more of a whole foods, maybe even paleo-ish diet, because there wasn't any alternatives in the like grain, the gluten market. So then all of a sudden these gluten-free foods come out on the market, and I wanted to partake just like everybody else. I'm like, oh my God, like donut, really? And even though I didn't eat that way normally, it's the same thing when I started eating these quote unquote gluten-free foods. I started to get sick all over again. And I say quote unquote because that's one of the reasons why I think that gluten-free foods can cause us problems, because in the U.S., the FDA allows for up to 19 parts per million of gluten in a food that's called gluten-free. And I know in Australia, you couldn't have 3 parts per million. It had to be 3 parts per million or less. I don't know if they're changing that. I've heard that people want to change that now to be 20 parts per million so they can be competitive with the rest of the market out there. But essentially what it means, 20 parts per million or 19 parts per million, it means that there's a certain amount of gluten that is still allowed in our gluten-free foods. And I've done a lot of research on it. And in fact, the FDA itself, this is just mind-boggling, did its own meta-analysis of all the papers out there that looked at what is the safety threshold for gluten. for people that are sensitive to it. And they basically determined, whoever wrote this paper within the FDA determined that 0.5 or something parts per million of gluten, essentially 0 parts per million of gluten, is safe for those that are most sensitive to it. And yet they then went ahead and said that, yeah, if you want to call your food gluten-free, just make sure it's less than 20 parts per million.
It's crazy, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
if you've got celiac disease or you've got a really severe sensitivity, that's plenty of gluten that you're still getting exposed to.
You are. I mean, there's one study that showed that there's this woman a woman with celiac disease who was very strict about her diet. She stuck to her diet very well, except for her one communion wafer once a week. And that was not, and I think you just take a bite of it. So it wasn't like it was even that much gluten, but just that once a week was enough to keep her from, ever getting better. So it's really important, but unfortunately the foods manufacturing industry has taken over gluten-free, and most people get their advice from, food labels often, or, and a lot of people also say, oh, gluten-free must be better for me because they see it everywhere now. And maybe they might have gluten sensitivity, but unfortunately, going gluten-free is just not as simple as taking your gluten foods and replacing them with the gluten-free foods. And so that the fact that there is still possibly gluten in many of these foods is one issue. Another issue is that once gluten has caused issues with your, gut, your gut is compromised, and now you have to heal it, and all kinds of things can happen after this. And of course, I know you know about carbohydrates, and how the bad bacteria can get into our gut, and candida can overgrow. And so when you're replacing your gluten foods with these gluten-free foods, you're not giving your body a break. In fact, you're just feeding these bad bacteria that love this kind of, sugary, refined sugar, refined flour, carbohydrates. It's like fast food to them.
It is. It's such a little powerhouse. It's interesting. I had an email just today from a person who has just been diagnosed with SIBO and said to me, just checking I can eat gluten-free bread. And my response was, any kind of bread, be it gluten or non-gluten containing bread, is like pouring petrol on or gas on a fire. It is just a little powerhouse of amazing fuel for our bacteria. And gluten-free bread in particular is generally, as a rule, so highly processed. We're using potato and tapioca or corn and rice flours that have been incredibly processed, so it's really refined. It's basically like eating cups of sugar, and our bacteria think it's great. And if they're in the wrong spot or we've got an overgrowth, then they're just like, hallelujah, it's party time. And I know that for myself, before I knew I had SIBO, and I had really cut down on the products of gluten-free products that I was eating. I was eating a lot more of a paleo diet than I ever had before, but occasionally I would have some gluten-free bread if I was out in a cafe and I wanted some toast with my breakfast, or if I really felt like some pasta and I hadn't learnt about zoodles yet, and I would have some gluten-free pasta. And I would just be so bloated as a result of it. And I now know it was because I was giving my bacteria just this huge feed of very accessible food to them. You've changed your diet quite considerably. Can you talk to me around what life is like for you now, and also how you eat now?
Right. So once those new gluten-free foods started to make me sick, I basically developed adrenal fatigue and leaky gut. Now, I'm not blaming it all on the gluten-free foods, because I also had a thyroid condition, which probably had gone on unchecked because I had 2 pregnancies, and the thyroid changes a lot during that. So there were all these factors that came together that made me very sick. I had adrenal fatigue, which means that I couldn't sleep at night and I was tired all day. And I had leaky gut. And again, doctors couldn't help me. I went and asked for help from a couple of different doctors, and one of them told me like, oh yeah, sure, we'd all be healthier if we ate less bagels. I'm like, no, I can't even have a crumb. And then another guy was, he said, oh, you're just depressed. And I was like, you know what I did? I said to him, I was like, no, I'm not depressed. And then I burst out crying because it wasn't depression that was making me sad. It was, it was everything else that was like, this is just ridiculous. Why do I keep having all these problems? So, I basically hadn't healed my gut. I had leaky gut or intestinal permeability. I don't know if you've discussed this on your show, I would imagine.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. So, but I only figured that out by the fact that I was reacting to every single food out there. I couldn't eat hummus anymore. I couldn't eat any seeds. I couldn't eat, I definitely couldn't eat dairy, soy. Everything was causing me problems. And so one by one, I just basically listened to my body, and one by one, I took all of these foods out, and it was getting ridiculous. But then I finally heard about this paleo diet, and I found out, oh my gosh, the diet that I'm eating by restricting all these foods actually has a name. And I thought that it was kind of a silly, fad diet, eat like the caveman did. Come on, But when I looked into the science behind it, I was like, oh wow, actually there is merit to this, and it makes a lot of sense. And anyway, my body was telling me this is how to eat anyway. So by going paleo and getting rid of all these foods, I felt so much better. I didn't have any brain fogs anymore. I barely got sick anymore. My immune system was definitely like starting to heal. I didn't have the adrenal fatigue. So I was mostly feeling a lot better. But there was still this one little nagging thing, is that I still had bloating, and I still had a little bit of digestive distress. It was way better than it had ever been, and I wasn't in a lot of pain. I wasn't getting sick much, so I wasn't really complaining. But I still had this little nagging thing, like, I don't understand. And then every once in a while, my stomach would bloat, like, hugely, like it looked like I was pregnant, and it was kind of embarrassing. So I still tried to figure out what that was. And I was certain that I had SIBO or SIBO. I don't know what, some people say SIBO, some people say SIBO, but I was certain that that's what I had, because my symptoms sounded so much like that. And so I went to another doctor, and he was actually an alternative healthcare guy. And I asked him to get a test for SIBO, but he said that he didn't believe in those tests because the hydrogen breath tests are not supposedly that accurate. And I was like, I don't care. I just want to know if I have this or not. So I sent away anyway to this company that does the tests. And they send you the results back, and they just give you this caveat that you have to have, a healthcare professional to interpret the results. But it was pretty easy to interpret. I did not have SIBO, and I was very unhappy. I was devastated because I really wanted it to be that, because I wanted to find out what is still causing me problems in my gut. And so I on a whim, because I didn't have anybody else to turn to, I went back to the company. I said, could there be anything else that like mimics the symptoms? And so then they sent me a free test for fructose malabsorption, which is also another hydrogen test. And I came back positive for that. And it turns out that all the apple and kale smoothies that I was eating, thinking I was so, being so healthy, was actually making me sick.
And that's quite often the case. Unfortunately, it's still very common that doctors say that they don't either believe in SIBO or SIBO or SIBO. There's all sorts of ways to pronounce it.
Okay.
And it's so interesting how many variations I hear on it. And that another common thing is that they don't believe in the accuracy of the testing, which I think is actually, I think it's a bit silly. Yes, there can be issues with accuracy on any test. So to say carte blanche that you will not do a test because you don't believe in its accuracy, I think is unfortunate for the patient. And if you are a patient that has had that said to you, I'd go and find another doctor. And they know now that if they do the lactulose and the glucose and the fructose test. They can do all three of those tests. That gives a very good indication of the likelihood of SIBO. And I know that when I did the lactulose breath test, which demonstrated I was hydrogen dominant, but also had some methane present in my SIBO. It was very clear from what came back that I had it. I didn't need to go and do any further testing. But fructose malabsorption often can go quite hand in hand with gut issues, and I'd like to hear about how you then managed, discovering that you weren't great with fructose and how you incorporated that into your life and your diet, which, you'd already restricted through going gluten-free and paleo.
And paleo. And then it's like, what? Now I have to take fructose out of my diet too? Oh my God, is there no end to this? It was really frustrating, especially when a lot of the things on the paleo diet that you eat that are healthy have fructose in it. So, cauliflower rice, like I said, apple and kale smoothies, all of these things I couldn't eat. So at that point, I actually went ketogenic because, I was told to go on the FODMAPs diet. So I'm sure you guys have probably talked about that diet too.
Yes, we have.
Yeah. And so I was told to go on that, but I was like, oh my God, this is really confusing. Okay. I thought going grain-free, dairy-free, soy-free, sugar-free, and everything else, legume-free was already enough. Now I have to look at all these different, it's getting really confusing, and I'm just tired of trying to figure out what to eat. So I actually went ketogenic. And I did also eat some carbs, but I had to make sure I did study the FODMAPs diet, and I did figure out what things I could and I couldn't eat. But basically, I just had a few safe carbs that I could eat, and mostly then was doing protein and fats, lots of fats. And I found the ketogenic diet to be very therapeutic and tasted good, and helped me to keep a slim figure as a side benefit. So there are all good things about the ketogenic diet, and I felt a lot better, and my body did quiet down, and I actually felt really good. But I wish I could say that's the happy ending. But then not too long after that, I guess so I think I was on the ketogenic diet for a year and a half. And then I started CrossFit, and not too many months after that, I developed a gynecological condition called adenomyosis.
I haven't actually heard of that one.
I know, it's a new one. It's a rare condition. And I was like, how many things can one girl have wrong with her,
Yeah.
And this is actually the subject of my next book, so I won't speak too much about it. But one of the things was, basically, I don't even know where to start on this. I went to the one gynecologist. She was a conventional doctor. I was like, could it have anything to do with my thyroid? And she's like, absolutely not. And I was like, but it's got to have something to do with hormones. And so the more I thought about it, I was like, started peeling back some layers, like realized that the thyroid disease that I had, stress related, IBS, stress related. I just have this great article from 2011, which is a literature review that shows specifically how stress affects the gut, how it can cause food allergies, it can cause increased intestinal permeability, it can cause, decreased motility, all these things. I'm like, wow, that sounds like me. So stress causes IBS, stress causes Graves' disease. And then why wouldn't it necessarily, help cause adenomyosis, which could actually be an autoimmune. It's shown some autoimmune markers. And so we know that autoimmune diseases can be caused by stress. So I think the CrossFit was kind of like a straw that broke the camel's back, that my body was really stressed. I was on a ketogenic diet, so I wasn't eating enough carbs, but I was really pushing my body with the CrossFit. And so I stopped that, but there was more to the story. I had to keep peeling back layers. I had just had a big cross-country move. That was kind of stressful, in a new community where I feel kind of isolated because I don't know people. That's kind of stressful. And then, but then I keep pulling back layers, and I've learned that that Graves' disease can be, has been attributed with papers since as far back as 1902, has been attributed to stress and really like emotional distress, including like emotional abuse. And I'm learning then that adverse childhood experiences can be the cause of so much of these chronic illnesses. And well, I have had adverse childhood experiences. Now, I don't know if you talked about this at all on your show, and maybe it's getting a little off topic, but gut, it is related to gut as well as other issues. And there is a website where you can take this test that talks, it's called ACE. What's your ACE score? Like how much of an adverse childhood did you experience? And I think I'm a 2 on that. So it's not like this huge thing, but I was basically emotionally abused, which is, it's like still a hard word to say because it's so strong of a word. But for most of my, developmental life. So I have this automatic shutting down of my system as soon as I face any kind of potential adversity. As soon as I get scared or worried about something, my gut shuts down. And so I've had to learn in the past year. And so good news is, I have looked at all what my stressors are, and I went into all these different stress reducing techniques, and not just yoga and meditation, which definitely help, but some really specific ones that are good for chronic, emotional traumas. And the good news is I've completely reversed the adenomyosis. So that is gone as of like basically a year later. Not even a whole year later did I reverse that. And I think that I'm actually, now that I realized that that was a stress-related disease, and I've been focusing, looking at stress head on, I'm actually now calming down my gut and able to start eating some of these foods again that were causing me problems. So I think there is a good, ending to this story. It's just a really long story.
It's so good to hear that some of these foods are coming back, and also that you've been able to reverse, that most recent condition. And it's something that I've seen in myself, and I know that it happens with others, that once we start to repair both our gut health, but also start to address some of these other layers that are happening in our body. Mine was stress as well. I had significant childhood trauma through abuse from a family member, sexual abuse, and it's only been in recent years that I've really actively dealt with that. And it was incredible, just the release I felt coming from my gut once I started to peel back the years of trauma I experienced at the hands of this adult when I was a young girl. So I think that sometimes when we have a diagnosis like SIBO, or we realize that gluten is becoming problematic, sometimes that's just the tip of the iceberg, and there's a lot more to come.
Yeah.
But I think that it can be a really positive thing ultimately, that we can end up being much healthier and much happier as a result. But like you say, it can be many years in the making.
Yeah, and I think this was the final thing that I needed to do, was to face the stress head on. And I think all of us know deep down inside that stress can cause us issues, but none of us really look at it deeply as to what might be really causing us problems. And, we might try to slow down a little bit or do some exercise that, helps to release some tension. But for those of us with chronic disease, the stress factor shouldn't be taken lightly. It's really something that is ingrained in our body. And what I learned is that, even though I knew now that my body would react in certain ways in stressful situations, because I was still having contact with this one parent as of even 6 months ago, and I could feel my gut clenching anytime I had to respond to an email or whatever, and I couldn't stop it. So it's not like you can just all of a sudden, start meditating and then this stuff goes away. It takes a long time, it takes practice, but there are some real tools out there that therapists are using to help us to release this emotional or stored trauma that it's actually been working for me. And one of the techniques was neurobiofeedback, where they put little wires on your brain and put some very minor electrical impulses to your brain, and it just kind of rejiggers it a little bit, so your brain kind of has to wobble and refix itself, if that's, if you can imagine that. And And it actually helped me to stop. Like all of a sudden, I didn't have this automatic clenching anymore. I was more in control from my mind and my heart. I was able to, step back and breathe and think about situations instead of reacting, which is what, I was always doing before. So that was a really great technique. And then there's also EMDR and sensory motor psychotherapy, two other tools that are really great for this kind of thing. But I think we could probably have a whole show on all of those techniques.
I think we could, and it's about finding what works for you. And sometimes it's one thing; it could be multiple things. I did a really great technique with I found an amazing psychologist here in Melbourne, Australia, and we did an amazing technique where I would close my eyes and we'd go back into one of the memories, and she would tap on my knees, and it was and both my knees, so left and right, and she'd go left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right through the session, and that was kind of helping rejig my brain as well, and taking out the huge emotional connection I had with it, and allowing the sensible side of my brain to rationally think through that experience, think through that trauma, take an adult perspective on it rather than a child perspective, and not going straight into fight or flight response, which is what I would do. And exactly the same thing would happen to me. It would go straight to my gut, and she'd say, "Where do you feel this?" And I'd say, "My gut." And my gut would be tied in knots and just feeling like it was churning. And now I have such greater control, and I don't have that overwhelming urge to flee when things get tough,
Yeah,
which I used to.
That
Which is
technique
fascinating.
is EMDR, and it started with rapid eye movement. They would go take the fingers from the left eye to the right eye, back and forth, and make you follow the eye. So it's the same thing. And then there's another therapist that has it. She's got two paddles. You hold one in the right hand, one in the left, and it goes back and forth. So that's interesting. That's the same technique, and there's something about that allows you to be in the present in a safe place while still entering that past trauma and release it. And it is fascinating. It's like magic, isn't it?
It really is. And I'd come out feeling often quite washed out because it was pretty intense going into memories that I hadn't wanted to think about for, many years. And in fact, I had actually blocked a lot of the memories as a protection from what was actually happening to me.
Sure.
And it was great. It was like after every session I felt like I was stepping forward, and I was kind of emerging as the person that I should be today. And it doesn't need to be a significant trauma like being sexually abused as a child. You can have other traumas. And I know that some listeners might be thinking, but I was never sexually abused, or I never got emotionally abused or physically abused. My trauma's not that bad. I'm sure I don't need to do too much with it. If there is a stressor in your life and it is causing anxiety, it doesn't matter how significant in your mind or not significant in your mind it is. If that's still causing a reaction, and it's still causing a reaction today, I think that these techniques can be incredibly beneficial. And it might be that you might just be really unhappy in your job, or you might have a boss who's a bit mean to you. It doesn't need to be that down to the nth degree of extreme trauma to do something. And obviously we need to look at our life and look at what changes, might need to be made in our lives to remove ourselves from overtly stressful situations. And if it's a workplace that's causing huge anxiety and stress, then I, often say to people, perhaps it's time to think about whether that workplace is the right workplace for you.
Right.
Taking control of your life. You're not a passenger in your life. You are the driver, and sitting back in the driver's seat and taking great control is empowering, and that in itself can often help reduce stress.
Absolutely. And I think that's where meditation comes in as a really good tool that's also free, and it allows you to find out what's actually happening in your brain. Like, whose thoughts are in your brain? Are they your thoughts, or are they somebody else's? And are you putting yourself down all the time? Are you putting other people down, or, rehashing old arguments? And you start to like filter through all the stuff that's going on up there, and you start to gain more clarity. And then then you can start to see, if it's a workplace issue, is there some things that you can resolve? Can you find acceptance in this? Or is it time to move on? But meditation gives you that space to just sit back and just allow your body and your thoughts and your energy to tell you what you need to do and what you can accept and what is okay for you to stand up and make decisions to do something else.
Now, you've got your book Going Gluten-Free. How can people get a copy of it? Where can they go? Is it on Amazon or your website?
Yep, it's on Amazon, and you can get it in, other countries as well. So, there's Amazon for Australia and Canada as well. So, it's on. There's an electronic version and there's a paperback version.
And your website is wonderful. So I'd love for you to just tell people how they can go and find your website. You've got a whole bunch of resources on there that can help people who are looking at going gluten-free or perhaps want to learn more about what gluten-free really means. Where can they find you?
Yeah, thanks. It's called Stuffed Pepper, and it's stuffed-pepper.com. And if you sign up for the newsletter, you get a free meal plan that just kind of gets you started on thinking about how to go totally grain-free. And there's also some paid meal plans if you want, to go a whole month and you're still trying to figure out, breakfasts and whatever you can do. It's only like $4.99 for a meal plan, so it's not that expensive, but it has links to all the recipes and stuff in it and a grocery list. And we also have a kid's guide to going gluten-free that you can find on there. That's like kind of activities for kids and kid-friendly recipes. And but also there's tons of free resources. Like I said, the free meal plan, and there's lots of recipes that we're uploading all the time. And then just different articles about, how your diet and your lifestyle affects your health. I've got some, tips on yoga poses or different meditations you can try, all kinds of things.
Wonderful. Heather, it's been just a joy to have you on the show today, and it's so clear that you are very knowledgeable on all things gluten-free and changing your diet and making a real difference. And even though the journey has taken some time, both of us starting around the end of the 90s and the early 2000s with our journey, it's great to see that you've taken what you might have felt was quite a lot of adversity at one point and made it into such a positive thing that you're helping other people. So thanks so much for coming on to the Healthy Gut podcast today.
Well, thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode with Heather Jacobsen. If you would like to get the show notes or any of the links mentioned in today's episode, head to thehealthygut.co/Heather. And you can also find links to the awesome events I have coming up in the US while I'm there this June and July. And I've got events happening all across the country, and I would absolutely love to see you there in person. But I'm also doing some live podcast recordings. So if you would like to see me in action interviewing some of the amazing SIBO specialists that I will be interviewing, make sure you pop your details down so that you can grab a seat at one of those recordings. Just head to thehealthygut.co/events. And on that page, you will see the events that are currently available. Tickets are selling fast. So if you are interested in coming along, make sure you do grab a ticket. And if an event in your city isn't up on the website yet, make sure you pop your details down, because I will be able to email you the moment information becomes available. Now, I absolutely love hearing your feedback. So it'd mean the world to me if you could go into iTunes or the app you use to listen to this podcast and leave a rating and also write a review. It really does help people who are looking for gut and SIBO related podcasts to know that this is the right one for them. And it also makes it really useful for me to hear your feedback, what you love about this show. If you're ever interested in me interviewing somebody, don't hesitate to drop me a line at info@thehealthygut.co. And follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Pinterest, and Google+. We're there under The Healthy Gut. Coming up on next week's show, I'm joined by Siobhan Sana, and we're talking about how you create your own SIBO dream team. And I've talked about this a lot, how once I had my dream team in place, recovery became so much easier. And I've got a very special announcement of a very exciting event that is coming up at the end of this month. So make sure you stay tuned to next week's episode with Siobhan. You've been listening to the Healthy Gut podcast with your host, Rebecca Coombs. To learn more about the Healthy Gut or our podcast, head to thehealthygut.co/podcast. And as we are fully funding this podcast, if you would like to help support the continuation of this podcast so that we can continue to bring you future episodes, all you need to do is make a contribution at thehealthygut.co/podcast. We would like to thank Belinda Coombs for the production, editing, and original music score of this podcast. To hear more of Belinda's music, head to soundcloud.com/Belinda Coombs. The Healthy Gut podcast is a production of The Healthy Gut. Thanks for listening.